definition encompasses a lot of things. Let me talk a bit about what it may mean and whether or not there's some kind of central analytic content here. A simplistic view might suggest that, well, we're simply experiencing a kind of proliferation of regimes, of norms, treaties, organizations, and so on. But I think that the concept of fragmentation must mean something more than just a growth in the sort of universe of cases. If that is all it is, there's no particular value added in introducing the concept of fragmentation. They speak about within a given issue area of international politics, and that leads us to wonder, or to think, and it's very much reinforced by what Sebastian had to say, that maybe this notion is somehow or other related to the discourse on regime complexes. Maybe it's part of a discussion of what people have called regime complexes, in which case one presumes that the concept may map onto what Cohen and Victor called the fragmentation integration spectrum, although as Sebastian has pointed out, maybe that spectrum in the Cohen and Victor articles is simplistic in its own right. That really complicates the issue, it seems to me. On the other hand, I got the sense from the overview paper that this, excuse me, that the authors want to somehow go beyond the framework of a kind of debate within the regime complex discourse or discussion and talk about something else. Faribault has mentioned several times the term complexity. And I have one sense that it may very well be the case that complexity is in some sense a more useful notion than fragmentation, especially if, as he insisted, fragmentation shouldn't necessarily have a negative connotation. It's just in some sense a descriptive characteristic. So if it's not just proliferation, it's not just expansion numerically, maybe it's a matter of increasing complexity. And one thinks there of an analogy, for example, to ecosystems, where as the number and variety of distinct species in an ecosystem increases, one can speak of complexity growing. I don't think one would say this is a more fragmented ecosystem, but you'd say it's a more complex ecosystem. And this clearly also doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation, because it's perfectly possible that a more complex ecosystem may, for example, turn out to be more resilient or more adaptable or less likely to suffer from collapse than a more simple ecosystem. So it strikes me that moving forward through the lens of complexity may actually be a useful way to go. But even then, in the case of ecosystems, complexity is somewhat easy to measure, because you say, well, let's look at whether there's an increase in the number of distinct species. One wonders, in the case of the institutional settings that we are looking at, whether or not there's just a similarly straightforward indicator. I mean, if fragmentation, or indeed complexity, is to be useful as a kind of empirical concept, or a concept that can support empirical analysis, then there must be some way, and I don't necessarily mean quantitatively, but there must be some way to measure and to say this issue area is more fragmented than that issue area. and to say this issue has become more fragmented or more complex than it was at time t.1 than it was at time t. And so short of that, in the absence of some kind of relatively stable set of indicators, there is, I think, a danger here that the concept of fragmentation will fall into the category of what people in the field of literary criticism say, I'll see it when I believe it. I'll see it when I believe it. In other words, I've got a concept, and I'm now going to see lots of it out there. I think we need to save ourselves from that kind of end state. So I could say more about the sort of conceptual and analytic side, but in the interest of time, let me push on to the causes, consequences, and responses. When it comes to causes, it seems to me that there are a number of different basic sources or drivers of fragmentation or complexity. It may simply be a simple proliferation. It may simply be varieties of players, actors, and so on, are creating new arrangements of one kind or another, more or less without reference to each other. And we, as analysts, back up and say, gosh, you know what? This is a more complex situation than it used to be. It just happens to be the case. Well, that's one sort of thing. It may also be that the complexity is, or fragmentation is a consequence of efforts to flesh out kind of functional, or as Sebastian said, spatial components of an overarching institutional arrangement where there is in some sense a logic of functionality, where we say, well, we need another component to deal with this or to deal with that or to other thing. That's a kind of a positive storyline that, well, complexity is a result of the growth and development of systems of institutions that are more and more comprehensive in terms of dealing with that kind of thing. I think another basic category, however, is related much more to partisanship, where various players create new or different institutions because they have interests that they want to promote, which they think may be easier to promote by creating new venues than would have been the case otherwise. And I think this is very much an evidence in the case in which Jeff and Sylvia were talking about, where whether it's the APP or the MEF or the G8, there's a very real sense in which some of the key players, the United States first and foremost, will say, you know what, we are frustrated, we don't think we can get our way in the UNFCCC, so we're going to create these other kinds of forums, these other kinds of mechanisms where we think maybe we can have more control, we can exercise our power more effectively, legitimately or not. This is a whole other sort of class of pathway, shall we say, toward increased complexity or increased fragmentation. And I think much depends on, in terms of getting the consequences, which of these basic categories of causes are at work. Simple proliferation, functional efficiency or effectiveness, partisanship. It seems to me that the story that Sebastian told out so much with his early conceptual slides, but with his case study of the Nagoya Protocol, is pretty much a situation in which the players said, well, look, we need to create an element, a component of the biodiversity regime to deal with a certain kind of problem. I mean, to me, this was not, it's hard to